You ever meet someone, and it's like something inside you just clicks? Not because they said something profound or did something dramatic, but because something about their presence, it shook something awake in you. Quietly, deeply, and ever since, you haven't been able to go back to who you were before. This video isn't about heartbreak. It's not about missing someone. It's about something much deeper, awakening. The kind that rattles your inner world in a way that's hard to explain. The kind of shift that doesn't let you return to sleep. You see, there's this idea the Stoics had. They talked about the inner citadel, that sacred, untouchable place inside every one of us. Most people live their whole lives without ever stepping inside. But every now and then, someone comes along, not to knock on the door, but to speak to something that was already living there. They don't even have to say anything special. It's just who they are. The way they move through the world. Something about their energy stirs a memory, a feeling, a truth that's been buried under the noise of everyday life. And in that moment, it's not just that you see them clearly, you see yourself more clearly. Maybe for the first time. That's what we're exploring today. That kind of presence. The kind that lingers long after someone's gone. Not because they made a grand exit or left you with a bunch of words to overanalyze, but because something about them made you look inward. And maybe you felt this. Maybe you've had that experience, where someone barely stays in your life, but somehow, they stay in you. You move on. Life continues. But they're still there in the quiet spaces of your mind. Not because of closure you didn't get, but because the connection wasn't on the surface, it was something deeper. Soul deep. Carl Jung once said that the unconscious isn't just a storage box for forgotten memories. It's a reservoir of truths we've never even fully seen. And when someone awakens that in you, they don't just become a memory. They become part of your structure, a part of your inner architecture. That's why it's not always the people who stayed the longest or said the most that we remember. It's the ones who reached into parts of us we didn't even know existed. Their silence echoes. Their energy lingers. They spoke in frequencies, not words. Plato had this beautiful idea, that each soul has a companion soul, cut from the same whole, always longing to be reunited. Now, not every connection is that dramatic, but some feel like they stretch across lifetimes. Like you didn't meet this person, you recognized them. And that familiarity? That strange comfort that makes no logical sense? It's not an accident. It's as if some ancient part of you sees something ancient in them. Like your soul nods and goes, there you are. So when someone awakens that feeling in you, or you awaken it in them, you don't just pass through each other's lives. You remain. Not physically. Not in pictures or status updates. But in the soul. In the quiet emotional and psychological layers of a person. Because you weren't just another name or face in their story. You were a mirror, a spark, a question that echoed long after the conversation ended. And that's the thing. You didn't have to say anything revolutionary. You didn't have to do anything. It was your energy, your truth, your way of simply being. That's what stayed with them. Because it wasn't about performance. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was real. Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." But the truth is, most people aren't ready to examine their lives until someone comes along and lights up the dark corners. Not to expose them, but to remind them there's more. More to feel. More to know. More to become. You didn't mean to do it. But just by being yourself, you became a mirror. And mirrors can be terrifying when someone spent years avoiding their own reflection. So even after you've moved on, even when there's no more conversation, no more contact, the echo of what you awakened doesn't disappear. It just changes form. It becomes something they carry, something they return to, often in silence, trying to understand what exactly it was that shifted. They don't remember your opinions. They don't remember what you wore. They remember how you made them feel. They remember the version of themselves they saw when you were around. Because that's the kind of presence that doesn't live on the surface. It burrows into the unconscious, into the soul. And once the soul has been stirred, it refuses to go back to sleep. You didn't offer them ease. You didn't offer escape. You offered a mirror, a reflection of something raw and real. Something they didn't know they were missing. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And that's why your presence felt so disruptive. Because it didn't give them something to chase. It gave them something to face. And let's be honest, most people aren't ready for that. They might retreat. They might disappear. They might even make you feel like you're the one who was too much. But you weren't. You were exactly what their soul needed, even if their mind wasn't ready. And that's the paradox, isn't it? The soul craves truth, but the mind craves comfort. And when you come along and stir something that's been resting in the dark for years, maybe their whole life, it creates tension. Internal tension. The kind that doesn't just go away. Because once someone feels a deeper version of themselves in your presence, they can't unfeel it. They try, of course. They'll distract themselves. They'll dive into routines. Maybe even new relationships. But something always feels off. The conversations that once entertained them, now they feel shallow. The distractions that once numbed the pain, now they feel pointless. Because once the curtain has been lifted, even slightly, ordinary no longer satisfies. And that's the thing about resonance. Real resonance. It doesn't ask for your permission. It doesn't follow rules or timelines. It just happens. Like a song that starts playing inside you, and no matter how hard you try, you can't turn it off. That's what you became to them. Not noise. Not static. A frequency. A vibration that shook the dust off parts of their soul they didn't know had gone quiet. You didn't fix them. You didn't save them. That's a mistake people often make, thinking that real connection is about completing someone. It's not. It's about revealing. You didn't fill a void. You exposed it. You didn't patch up their wounds. You simply made them aware they were still bleeding. And that's where the shift happens. Because now, the healing is theirs to do. You might never see it. You might never hear from them again. But trust me, your presence started a domino effect. Maybe not in their outer world, but in their inner one. The part they rarely show anyone. You see, sometimes the biggest changes in a person's life don't come with loud announcements or dramatic transformations. Sometimes they start with a whisper, a memory, a moment of quiet when the world stops just long enough for them to feel something shift inside. And when that happens, nothing looks the same afterward. Not their friendships, not their goals, not even their idea of love. Because you didn't just enter their life, you entered their awareness. And awareness? That's irreversible. Plato once said that the soul doesn't learn truth, it remembers it. That's what you were. A reminder. A glimpse into a version of themselves they'd forgotten. A version that felt alive, honest, unfiltered. And here's what makes it even more powerful. You didn't force anything. You weren't trying to be anything. You weren't performing. You just were. And that kind of authenticity, it's magnetic. Especially to someone who's used to masks. To someone who's spent years being who they thought they needed to be, instead of who they actually are. You showed up real. And that realness, it reflected back something raw in them. Maybe even something sacred. So if they pulled away, if they vanished, it wasn't rejection. It was reflection. A mirror too clear to stare into for long. You might never know the full extent of the impact you had. And that's okay. Because this wasn't about being remembered. It was about being transformational. And transformation doesn't require recognition. It only requires truth. The Stoics believed that true power lies not in what we control externally, but in our internal citadel. That unshakable core within us that holds who we really are. And sometimes, it takes another person, just one, to wake that up. Not through advice. Not through guidance. But through presence. Through stillness. Through showing us, often without words, that there is more within us than we've ever dared to face. That's what you did. And when they think of you now, it's not about affection. It's about activation. You spark something. Something ancient. Something tender. And maybe even a little terrifying. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the part of ourselves we bury, deny, pretend doesn't exist. You didn't try to expose their shadow. But your energy, it brushed up against it. And once that happens, the soul can't go back to pretending. That's why they still think of you. That's why your memory lingers, not as a person they miss, but as a threshold they crossed. You weren't just someone who walked into their life. You were a turning point, a before and after moment. Even now, they might not know how to explain it. It might not even make sense to them logically. But the feeling remains. Subtle, quiet, unshakable. Like the scent of rain before it falls. Like a melody they didn't know they knew. You became that. A symbol. Not of perfection, or romance, or longing, but of truth. And truth, when it resonates at the level of the soul, is unforgettable. So if they show up again one day, it may not be with the words you expect. It might not be, "I miss you," or "I need you." It might be silence. A glance. A message that feels vague but loaded. Because what they're searching for isn't always you, it's the feeling you awakened. The part of themselves they saw in your presence. And maybe they'll never say it. Maybe they'll never reach out. But their soul remembers. Boys. Because once a mirror has been shown, even if it's put away, its reflection remains. Here's something most people don't realize. When someone disappears after feeling something deep with you, they're not always running from you. They're running from the mirror you held up. Because what you showed them wasn't your love or your presence, it was themselves. You revealed a version of them that they weren't ready to meet yet. One that was unmasked, unguarded, and painfully honest. And when someone's been living inside a story they've told themselves for years, the truth can feel like an earthquake. You didn't bring the chaos. You simply revealed the cracks. That's why you stay in their thoughts, not like a ghost from the past, but like a question that won't stop echoing. They don't replay your words because they were poetic. They replay the feeling behind them, the silence between sentences, the sense that someone finally saw them without filters, and didn't flinch. And let's be real, it's rare. Most of us walk through life starving to be seen, while also terrified of being exposed. We crave connection, but we wear armor. And when someone comes along who doesn't try to tear down your defenses, but simply sees through them, that's not something you forget. That's why your presence lingers. Because it didn't speak to the roles they play. It spoke to the person behind the roles. That's also why some people will retreat. Not because you were too intense, but because your presence made it impossible for them to keep performing. You reminded them of what it feels like to be real. And once you felt that, once your soul has tasted what real feels like, it can't go back to pretending. Not comfortably. Not for long. Even if they try to move on, even if they tell themselves it wasn't that deep, their inner world knows better. Because the soul doesn't forget the one who stirred it awake. Carl Jung said, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size." And that's what happens with presence like yours. If someone tries to suppress the impact, it doesn't disappear. It shapeshifts. It shows up in their dreams, in their quiet moments, in the way nothing quite feels the same anymore. They'll try to make sense of it, rationalize it, maybe tell themselves it was just timing, or projection, or some brief emotional confusion. But logic can't explain away a soul-level recognition. It can only delay the moment they finally face it. Because the truth isn't polite. It doesn't wait for convenient timing. It arrives when it's needed, often when it's least expected. And you? You didn't come into their life to stay. You came to awaken. There's a difference. Not all connections are meant to be lifelong. Some are meant to shake us awake, challenge our identity, and leave us standing at the threshold of something deeper. You might have been that threshold. And that's why they can't fully let go. Not because they're hung up on you, but because they're still trying to process what you revealed. You pulled back the curtain, and now they have to decide whether to walk through, or pull the curtain closed again and pretend they never saw what was behind it. But pretending doesn't erase the memory. They'll start to notice it in strange ways. In the books they choose. In the conversations they avoid. In the way their laughter doesn't quite reach as deep as it used to. Because something changed. Even if everything looks the same on the surface. You weren't a chapter in their story. You were a shift in their story. A turning point. Even if they never say it, their soul remembers. And this is the part no one tells you about being that kind of presence. It's heavy. It's lonely. Because you rarely get to stay and see the impact. You don't get the thank you. You don't get the closure. You don't get the happily ever after. But you do leave them better than you found them. Not because you healed them, but because you reminded them there was something inside worth healing. That's the work of a mirror. It doesn't do the fixing. It just reveals the truth. And when someone has lived for so long avoiding themselves, that first reflection is often too much to bear. So they run, or they freeze, or they lash out. Not because you were wrong for them, but because you were real for them. And real? Real is rare. It's raw. It's disruptive. It doesn't fit neatly into labels like friend, lover, or stranger. It's beyond category. It's beyond story. It's beyond what most people are used to feeling. That's why they'll try to label it, dismiss it, put it in a box. Say things like, it wasn't that serious, or it was just a phase. But the soul doesn't operate in labels. It operates in resonance. And when someone has resonated with your energy, when your essence has touched something buried inside them, that doesn't fade with time. It deepens. Because symbols don't disappear. They evolve. They grow in meaning. They show up again and again in different forms until the message is received. You didn't leave a memory. You left a myth. A symbol of something bigger than the moment. Something that now lives inside their unconscious. Not as you, the person, but as what you represented. As the doorway to a part of themselves they didn't know was still alive. And that kind of presence? It doesn't fade. It transforms. That's the beauty and the burden of being a symbol in someone's story. You're no longer just a memory, you become a mirror they carry. Not a mirror of how things used to be, but a mirror of who they might become. You weren't the destination. You were the invitation, the nudge, the disruption that made them question, even just for a moment, if the life they were living was really theirs. And that kind of disruption? It's not always welcomed. In fact, it's often rejected. Because most people build their identity like a fortress. Carefully, over time, out of past experiences, social expectations, and half-forgotten wounds. So when you walk in with your stillness, your truth, your effortless depth, and suddenly something inside them starts shaking, they don't always say thank you. They say goodbye. But don't mistake distance for indifference. Some people retreat not because they didn't feel something, but because they felt too much. You walked in, and suddenly, their carefully curated world didn't feel so safe anymore. Not because you threatened it, but because your presence made them realize how small it had become. And that realization? It doesn't fade just because you're not around to remind them. It lingers. It whispers in their quieter moments. It becomes the background hum to everything they do. Even if they never tell you. Even if they pretend it didn't matter. Because here's what most people won't admit. The deepest transformations in life are rarely loud. They don't always come with breakdowns or breakthroughs. Sometimes, they begin with the softest of disruptions. A glance. A sentence. A few moments of eye contact that lasted longer than it should have. And suddenly, the world feels different. That was your impact. Not thunder. Not lightning. Just a shift in the air they're still trying to explain. And maybe they've convinced themselves it wasn't real. That it was projection. Fantasy. Something they imagined. But deep down, something knows. Because the soul doesn't need permission to remember. It just does. And once the remembering begins, even if they try to silence it, it speaks louder. In dreams. In déjà vu. In unexpected emotions that rise when they hear a voice that sounds like yours. Or walk into a room that smells vaguely familiar. You didn't leave fingerprints. You left impressions. In the atmosphere. In the way they now question themselves. In the sudden awareness that something is missing, something they can't quite name. That's what happens when someone becomes a symbol. When their presence touches not just your thoughts, but your structure. You don't get over it. You carry it. Sometimes with grace. Sometimes with resistance. But either way, it's there. And maybe you've felt this from your side too. Maybe you've tried to forget someone, only to feel them more vividly in their absence. Maybe you've moved on in every visible way, and yet, they still show up in your inner world. Not because you're clinging, but because something real happened. Something that didn't just pass through you. It moved you. That's what real presence does. It doesn't entertain. It awakens. And awakened parts of us don't just go back to sleep because it's convenient. Once we've seen truth, especially the truth of our own soul, we don't unsee it. We don't unfeel it. We either grow with it or try to outrun it. And running only delays the inevitable. Because the soul always circles back. That's why some people come back into your life after months or years. Not because they missed the romance, but because they can't ignore the reflection anymore. They've done the distractions. They've tried the noise. But the silence you left behind? It stayed. And in that silence, something started to take root. Not obsession. Not regret. But a longing for clarity. Not clarity about you. Clarity about themselves. Because you weren't their answer. You were their question. And questions that matter? They echo. They get louder over time. Especially when someone is finally ready to stop running from their own depth. So if you ever wonder why someone returns with hesitancy in their voice, with a text that reads like a whisper, with eyes that can't quite meet yours, it's not weakness. It's not confusion. It's reverence. Because you weren't just a person in their past. You were the doorway to their real self. And they're finally brave enough to knock. The Stoics would say that we are only disturbed by our judgments, not by things themselves. But what happens when a person enters our life who changes our judgments completely? Who shifts our understanding of what's valuable, what's true, what's real? That's not just a memory. That's a transformation. And transformation doesn't always come with confetti. Sometimes, it arrives wearing silence and leaves wearing questions. And now, those questions live inside them. Every decision they make. Every connection they attempt. Every quiet night when they wonder why things feel off. Your energy, your presence, that moment of resonance, it lingers. Not like a wound, but like a compass. They're still figuring out where it leads. And maybe they'll never tell you. Maybe they won't ever say, "You changed me." Not because it didn't happen, but because they don't know how to put it into words. Because how do you explain the moment you realized you weren't who you thought you were? How do you thank someone for disrupting your life in a way that left you clearer? The truth is, they might never find the right way to say it. But it'll show. It'll show in the way they start craving deeper conversations and no longer settle for small talk. In how they begin to pull away from people who drain them. In how they stop tolerating the roles they've outgrown. That's the quiet legacy of your presence. Because once someone's soul has been touched, it doesn't settle for pretense anymore. And no, you didn't make that happen. You simply sparked it. The rest was already in them. Plato said the soul remembers beauty, not just in the aesthetic sense, but the kind of beauty that aligns with truth. That when we encounter something, or someone, truly beautiful, we're not discovering something new. We're remembering something ancient, something eternal. That's why the impact of your presence wasn't about attraction or affection. It was about recognition. They didn't fall for you. They fell into themselves. They met a version of themselves they had forgotten or perhaps never really known. And it startled them. Not in a fearful way, but in a way that shook the foundations of everything they thought was solid. That's the power of resonance. It's not a spark that fades. It's a frequency that continues humming long after the moment has passed. It weaves itself into decisions, reflections, dreams, even new relationships. Because now the bar is different. The energy they look for in others is different. The questions they ask themselves are deeper, not because you gave them new beliefs, but because you pulled back the curtain on the ones they already had, hidden, waiting. And that's the mark you left. Not a footprint, not a shadow, but a shift. And shifts don't fade. They evolve. They grow. They echo. They reshape the inner world. And even if they tell themselves otherwise, even if they fill their days with distractions and people and new plans, that echo? It's still there. In the stillness. In the space between activities. In the way their thoughts slow down when they're alone. That's where you live now. Not in their mind, but in their meaning. You became part of their unfolding. Not because you stayed, but because you showed up. Fully. Authentically. Without trying to mold them, change them, convince them. You were just you. And that was enough to shift the entire story. That's why they might revisit your words, your silence, your energy, not out of nostalgia, but out of curiosity. They're not trying to relive the past. They're trying to understand it, trying to grasp how a moment so brief could feel so eternal. Because you weren't a moment, you were a mirror. And when the soul sees itself clearly for the first time, it keeps returning to that reflection until it makes sense. Even if that takes months, even if it takes years, even if it never fully does. And maybe they'll never come back. Maybe life will pull you both in different directions. That doesn't erase the imprint. Because symbols don't depend on proximity. They live in the unconscious. They show up when needed, sometimes years later, sometimes in entirely unrelated moments. They might be listening to a song, standing at a train station, or looking into the eyes of someone new, and suddenly, there you are. Not your face, but your energy, the way you made them feel, the part of themselves that you reminded them of. That essence? That never dies. Carl Jung believed the psyche speaks in symbols, in images, feelings, dreams. Not in logic. Not in words. And once you've become a symbol in someone's inner world, you don't fade like a contact name. You evolve. You return in metaphors, in patterns, in subtle awakenings they can't quite name. And maybe that's what you were meant to be. Not a lover, not a friend, but a threshold. The one who opened the door to something sacred inside them. The one who lit a match in a room they didn't know they had. The one who didn't fix their story, but made them realize they were allowed to rewrite it. That's what presence can do. That's what your presence did. So if they ever say, I can't explain it, it's not because it wasn't real. It's because it was too real to explain. So, what now? What do you do with this kind of presence, this kind of impact, when the story didn't continue, when the connection didn't become a relationship, or when they walked away without fully understanding what they were walking away from? You honor it. Not by chasing it, not by clinging to the what if, but by recognizing that not all connections are meant to be completed in the traditional sense. Some are meant to ignite. Some people come into your life not to stay, but to awaken, to crack something open, to hand you a mirror, even if only for a moment. And when that mirror shows you a version of yourself that feels more alive, more true than anything before, it's a gift. It's not a loss. It's a beginning. And whether they return or disappear forever doesn't change what happened. Doesn't change the fact that you were seen. That something inside you stirred. That the story you've been living now has a new chapter waiting to be written. That's how soul-level connections work. They don't play by the rules of logic or time. They arrive when needed. They shake the parts of us that have grown too comfortable. And then they either stay to walk with us, or leave to let us walk alone. But either way, we're different. We're changed. We're awake. The Stoics taught that true strength is found in clarity, knowing what we control, what we don't, and how to return to the stillness within ourselves when everything around us changes. That's what this kind of connection ultimately offers. Not another person, but a path back to yourself. So if you've felt this, if you've experienced a bond that seemed brief yet eternal, confusing yet deeply familiar, it doesn't mean you're broken or obsessive or stuck in the past. It means something real happened. It means something meaningful was awakened in you, And now, you have a responsibility to carry it forward. Not for them, for you. Because once you've been shown who you could become, the soul won't rest until you become it. And the person who stirred that transformation? They were never the destination. They were the catalyst. So let them go, not in bitterness, but in gratitude. And let their presence live on in the way you choose to show up in the world. Because that's how energy like that works. It doesn't die. It transfers. It becomes the standard for the kind of connection you now know is possible. The kind of honesty you crave. The depth you won't abandon. The version of yourself you're no longer afraid to become. And if they come back, let it be because they found that courage too. Not because of nostalgia, but because of growth. Because their soul circled back to the moment they first felt alive and finally said, I'm ready now. And if they don't, that's okay, because the mirror still stands. The truth still echoes. And your journey continues. So maybe the question isn't, why did they leave? Maybe the real question is, what did they awaken that you're now meant to grow? You didn't come into their life to be everything. You came to be something. And sometimes, that something is the most important piece in their whole puzzle. Not because it completes the picture, but because it shows them how incomplete the picture truly was. So walk on with that truth. Not heavy, not burdened, but lit up from within. Because someone out there is going to meet you after you've walked through all of this. And they'll meet the version of you who's done hiding, who's done dimming, who's done shrinking for anyone who couldn't handle your reflection. They'll meet the real you, the awake you. And this time, you won't question if it's too much. Because now you know, what awakens the soul was never meant to stay asleep.